Do you believe in miracles? Now imagine someone like Bill Maher, a man who's spent decades challenging and mocking religion, suddenly faced with something he can't quite explain. Maher is no stranger to controversy, known for his razor-sharp wit and relentless critiques, especially when it comes to matters of faith. He's built a career on saying what others wouldn't dare. And for him, religion wasn't just questionable. It was something people used to feel safe, a belief he could tear apart on a stage and get laughs for doing it. Growing up in New York City and later in New Jersey, Maher's childhood was far from religious. His mother was Jewish, his father Catholic, but his family wasn't deeply committed to either faith. They didn't attend synagogue or church every weekend, and Maher remembers a household where belief wasn't really discussed. As he got older, he started questioning everything, including his parents' quiet acceptance of faith. To him, religion was something people turned to when they couldn't handle reality. By the time he reached adulthood, he was fully convinced he didn't need it. He put his trust in science, reason, and his own mind. Maher's big break came when he found a way to combine his humor with his skepticism. From the beginning, he was different. He wasn't just funny, he was unfiltered, ready to poke fun at society's untouchable topics. People loved him for it. His shows, from politically incorrect to real-time, became places where he could openly challenge traditional beliefs and stir the pot. Religion, social norms, politics, nothing was off-limits, and his audience couldn't get enough of it. By 2008, Maher decided to take things a step further with Relentless, a documentary aimed directly at exposing what he saw as the flaws of organized religion. He traveled around the world, interviewing believers of all kinds. Christians, Muslims, Jews, you name it. His questions were bold, his approach blunt. He saw Relentless as his way of helping people wake up, to question everything they'd been told, to see the holes in the stories they followed. He was certain that if more people looked at faith the way he did, they'd see it as just another human-made illusion. And his fans agreed. Maher had a following of skeptics who appreciated his honesty, his humor, and his fearlessness. But even for someone as outspoken as Bill Maher, there was always a small question that lingered in the back of his mind. With all his confidence, he sometimes wondered if he was missing something. A nagging thought he'd bury, but one that never really went away. Despite his strong public persona, Maher wasn't immune to those quieter moments of doubt. In the stillness of his own life, away from the laughter, the applause, and the cameras, he sometimes found himself wondering, could there really be something out there that I haven't figured out yet? It was an odd feeling, one he didn't often talk about. Why would he? After all, he had everything he'd ever wanted. Fame, a successful career, millions of fans. But every once in a while, that small voice inside him would ask, what if? One evening, while staying in New York City, Maher got a surprising invitation. It was from an old friend he hadn't seen in years, someone who'd reached out with something different to say. His friend had found faith and wanted Maher to come to a church service, saying it was something he thought Maher should experience. Normally, Maher would laugh off an invitation like this. Church? Not exactly his idea of a good time, but this time, something felt different. Curiosity? Maybe. Or maybe it was that voice again, the one that whispered he could be missing something. So, he went. He didn't know what he'd find there, but he walked into that small New York church with his usual skepticism, and maybe just a little bit of hope. The church itself was simple, almost humble, with a warmth he didn't expect. People greeted him with smiles that felt sincere, like he belonged there, even though that they didn't know him. He found a seat in the back, settling in quietly, feeling out of place but somehow open. For the first time, Maher wasn't in a church to question or make fun. He was just there, willing to see what might happen. What he found wasn't a grand sermon or a flashy display. It was something else entirely. As the service began, Maher sat quietly, unsure of what to expect. He looked around, noticing the people nearby. Some were older, some young, a mix of backgrounds, all here for a purpose he couldn't quite grasp. A part of him wanted to leave, but something kept him in that seat, watching, listening. Then, a man walked up to the front of the congregation. He looked to be in his late 30s, dressed simply, with an expression that seemed both calm and intense. He began to share his story, about losing everything he thought mattered, about struggling with addiction, losing his family, and finally finding himself at the end of his rope. Maher watched, half listening, thinking this was just another story, until something in the man's words hit him in a way he hadn't expected. The man talked about how, at his lowest point, he'd walked into this very church and found himself surrounded by people who genuinely cared. They hadn't judged him, they hadn't pushed him away. They'd simply accepted him, flaws and all, and helped him piece his life back together. The sincerity in the man's voice struck a nerve with Maher. For years, he'd looked at faith as a crutch, something people turned to when they couldn't deal with reality. But sitting there, listening to this man's story, he saw something different. This wasn't just about belief. It was about connection, acceptance, and finding hope when all seemed lost. And for the first time, Maher felt an emotion he couldn't easily dismiss, something that went deeper than reason or skepticism. Maher left the church that night feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of calm he couldn't quite explain. Walking back through the city streets, he replayed the man's words in his mind, the sense of peace in that room, and the feeling of something greater than himself, something beyond the laughter and applause he'd always relied on. He didn't have answers, but he had questions he couldn't ignore. Back at his hotel, Maher spotted a Bible on the nightstand. Usually, he would have ignored it, maybe even made a joke about it, but tonight he picked it up. Flipping through the thin pages, his eyes scanning passages he'd probably heard a dozen times before but never really paid attention to. His eyes fell on a line. "Come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest." He read it again, letting the words sink in, feeling something that, for once, didn't need a punchline or a clever rebuttal. It felt real. In the days that followed, Maher kept reflecting on that night. He found himself wanting to know more, not to disprove anything, not to critique, but to understand. He'd spent a lifetime mocking faith, but now he was beginning to see it differently. He began talking about it in interviews, sharing bits of his experience, though still cautiously. When asked if he believed in God, he'd pause, smile in a way that made people wonder and say, "I'm starting to understand things I didn't before." His words surprised his fans and friends alike, leaving them with questions of their own. As time went on, Maher's newfound perspective began to shape him in ways he hadn't expected. He wasn't rushing into anything, wasn't claiming to have all the answers, but he had a new respect for something he'd once dismissed entirely. He saw faith not as blind belief, but as a source of strength, a way for people to find hope and community. And as he shared his story with others, he found that people were listening. Not just fans, but people from all walks of life, curious about what had happened to bring such a change. In one of his later interviews, someone asked him directly, "So, Bill, do you believe now?" Maher paused, that familiar look in his eyes, a mix of humor and thoughtfulness. "I believe in a lot of things," he said finally, "and I think I'm still figuring it out. But that night in New York showed me something I can't deny. Sometimes things happen that are bigger than us, and maybe that's what faith is." His answer was simple, honest, and for once, without the edge of sarcasm he was known for. And so, Bill Maher, the man who had built a career on questioning everything, found himself living with a new kind of openness, a new sense of purpose. His story wasn't about a sudden conversion. It was about finding peace in something he once thought was impossible. Maher's journey reminded people that even the most skeptical among us might just be searching for something real, something that doesn't always fit neatly into words or logic. And sometimes that's where the miracle lies.